Good morning to all our participants from the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and good evening to those from the US East Coast and Canada. I'm Marites Vitug, your moderator for today's webinar entitled Is Hong Kong's Present Going to be Asia's Future? This is the second in a series of webinars anchored on the theme, The Future of Democracy in Asia. It is organized by the Council for Asian Liberals and Democrats, or CALD, and the National Democratic Institute, or NDI. We are using the platform StreamYard, and we are being streamed live on the Facebook pages of CALD and NDI and Senator Pangilinan's Facebook page as well. You can also watch us on the YouTube channel of CALD. Here are some house rules before we proceed. To those who are watching us on Facebook, via Facebook from Asia to North America, you may post your questions on the Facebook comment section, and we will try our best to address them during the open forum. Don't forget to include your name, affiliation, and to whom the question is directed to. So let's begin this forum with a very timely topic. May I introduce our first speaker, Senator Francis or Kiko Pangilinan, a leading opposition figure in the Philippines. He chairs the Council for Asian Liberals and Democrats and is the president of the Liberal Party here in the Philippines. May I call on Senator Pangilinan to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Marites, for the kind introduction. Good morning from the Philippines and to the rest of the world. I'd like to greet Emily Lau, our CALD individual member and former Hong Kong Legislative Council member, Kathy Chen, Vice President of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, Manfred Anand from the National Democratic Institute. We also have Moritz Klein of Berghoff of FNF in Bangkok, regional office. Of course, Richard Hidarian, our fellow Filipino and public educator and columnist of the Philippine Daily Inquirer. And I hope I didn't miss anyone. And to our distinguished guests, again, good morning. While the world grapples with the pandemic's devastating toll on people's lives and countries' economies, China has taken a series of aggressive geopolitical skirmishes with an array of its neighbors. According to news reports, in the past few months alone, China clashed with India in one of the worst border flare-ups in decades. Escalated standoffs with Vietnam and Malaysia in the South China Sea, pressured Taiwan with nighttime drills in the Taiwan Strait, and threatened Australia with boycotts of wine, beef, barley, and Chinese students. Chinese military ships, or a ship, has also targeted a Philippine naval ship with weapons control radar, which observers say was a provocative move that heightens the risk of military confrontation in the area. Last month, China has passed a wide-ranging new security law for Hong Kong, which makes it easier to punish protesters and reduces the city's autonomy. Here in the Philippines, we are confronting a newly signed Anti-Terrorism Act, which is vague and overbroad definition of terrorism and other related crimes, and which allows for up to 24-day warrantless detention of terrorism suspects. This law, which endangers constitutionally protected rights in the country, such as freedom of speech, the press, and of assembly, has been met with comprehensive and united opposition. Close to 20 petitions are now pending before our Supreme Court, filed by over 100 individuals and groups, including this representation. As we join the global initiative to defeat the unseen virus, civil libertarians around the world must continue to put up a united stand against tyranny and aggressors in order to push for a democratic rule-based order. With CALD at the helm, regional leaders must pursue new forms of cooperation and coordination to build more equal and capable regional partnerships and institutions in the long recovery ahead. We must work to strengthen our grassroots base and invigorate people, especially the young, to make them realize the relevance in nation building. After all, Did we ever imagine a regional alliance of young netizens forming from their love of milk tea? Alleged Chinese cyberbullying of a Thai film star spawned a quote unquote milk tea alliance that forged solidarity among Thai, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, and other Southeast Asian nationals online. Netizens from India and Australia also later joined this online milk tea alliance. A bottom-up spontaneous initiative, the Milk Tea Alliance is the young generation's attempt to keep China's unmatchable power in check. Drawing lessons from it, we elected officials from our respective countries must unite and cooperate, online and offline, and address the long-felt need to rebalance power dynamics in our region. With China's continuous rise as a regional and global superpower, we ask, will Taiwan be the next Hong Kong? What is the future of democracy in Asia? This webinar series aims to precisely address this question. Speakers, experts on the ground in Hong Kong and in Taiwan have been invited to share with us their insights and experiences that will shed light on the future of Hong Kong and Taiwan. Also present are reactors from other Asian nations to discuss where democracy is headed in the region. We welcome everyone to this webinar, and we look forward to a fruitful exchange of ideas. As we say in the Philippines, maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Pangilinan, for laying the context and the tone for this webinar. I will now introduce our three speakers in the order of their presentations. Each one of them will speak for 10 minutes. Our first speaker will be Emily Lau, a member of the Council for Asian Liberals and Democrats, and currently chairs the International Affairs Committee of the Democratic Party of Hong Kong, which she once headed. Emily was the first woman legislator directly elected by the people of Hong Kong. She's also a former journalist. Emily joins us from Hong Kong, the epicenter of this security law. She will address the question, after the imposition of the national security law, what now for Hong Kong? The next speaker will be Katie Chen. She's the Vice President of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. She oversees international affairs at the foundation. Katie is a political scientist by training, and she has a doctorate in political science from the University of Oklahoma. Katie joins us from Taipei, and she will address the question, will Taiwan be next? Our third speaker will be Manpreet Singh Anand. He is the Regional Director for Asia Pacific Programs of the National Democratic Institute. He was an adjunct professor at the National Defense University, and he also served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. Manpreet joins us from Washington, D.C., and he will talk about how the global community of Democrats must respond to this crisis. May I now call on Emily for her.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and a very good morning and good evening to all our friends from all over the world. And I'm very happy to be speaking to you from Hong Kong, because for a while, some people were worried that whether we can find a speaker from Hong Kong or whether many of us, the activists, have been intimidated into silence by the national security law, which was imposed by Beijing on us at the beginning of July. And I can tell you that I am still alive and kicking and speaking to you. But what are the consequences? We will find out. But I think many of us in Hong Kong refused to be intimidated into silence. But neither would I, of course, deliberately breach articles of this new law, and so that the national security people or the Hong Kong police can immediately come in to arrest me. So, but I will, use my liberty and my friendship with you all to inform you of what's happening. But more importantly, to answer your question about, is Hong Kong's present going to be Asia's future? And I certainly hope not, because I have been with friends from COUD and other places for a few years. And before this thing, Hong Kong was a very vibrant, free, and safe city, welcoming visitors from all over the world. And we, of course, struggle very hard for democracy, and we still haven't got it. But in spite of that, the level of freedoms and personal safety and the rule of law that we enjoy is much higher than some places, countries which have periodic elections. And that's the irony of Hong Kong. And armed with the freedom, with the personal safety, the rule of law, we struggle very hard for democracy. But then things began going very wrong when Xi Jinping became president of the People's Republic of China at the end of 2012. And he started adopting very harsh policies, not just on the people in mainland China, but increasingly on Hong Kong. And what made things take a very nasty turn was the chief executive Carrie Lam's bill for extradition in last year. It was sparked by a murder in Taiwan, but then it became something that Carrie Lam wanted to use to allow Hong Kong to send people to mainland China for trials. And so people were very frightened. We had endless protests. You saw the people clashing with the police, vandalism, people getting hurt. 10,000 people have been arrested so far. A lot of police brutality. And then, of course, it gave the Chinese Communist Party the excuse to say things are out of control and they have to impose this national security law on Hong Kong. And they did it just in a matter of weeks without consulting the Hong Kong people. And they just imposed it on Hong Kong in July. And they only unveiled the law to the people almost at midnight on the 30th of June. But then on the 1st of July, we saw thousands, some would say tens of thousands of people pouring into the streets to march, to demonstrate illegally because they have no police permission. So that would show you that although some people have been intimidated, some groups have disbanded, but there are others who are very, very determined to fight on. And I want to inform our friends in the international community not to trust the communist propaganda saying that people are fighting to secede from the PRC. They are fighting for independence. There are some people who ask for that, but I don't think they represent majority opinion. What the vast majority of the Hong Kong people want is to be able to, under Beijing's policy of one country, two systems, and that's something they agreed with the British way back in 1984. Under that joint declaration, China said that after 1997, when Hong Kong's returned to the PRC, the people will continue to enjoy free lifestyle, the rule of law, personal safety, independence of the judiciary for 50 years until 2047. So what the Hong Kong people want is for Beijing to keep that promise. But now we see the whole thing unraveling before our eyes. That's why I do not want the rest of the world or countries and places in the world to share our fate. When we had such a safe and peaceful life for 23 years, and now it's all disintegrating. And we want the Communist Party to listen to the people of Hong Kong, to listen to their friends in the international community, and not to act in such a way. But I think we all recognize that China is going to be around. What we need to do is to engage China, get China to behave according to the code of behavior of the civilized world, saying that you respect the people's human rights, the rule of law, their personal safety, independence of the judiciary. When Beijing foisted the national security law on us. Of course, it created a reign of terror. People started self-censoring themselves, saying they will not speak, they will not say things in public, do things that may get them into trouble. But there are countries which made statements to support Hong Kong. But then Beijing got even more countries to make statements to support the national security law. But these countries, most of them, do not respect the rights of their people. Although they may have periodic elections, but their people, the level of freedoms, personal safety, the rule of law that people in those countries enjoy, it's much less than what we enjoy in Hong Kong. So the international community is very split. But no matter what, I think we have to engage China. We have to tell China what is expected, tell China to abide by the code of behavior of the civilized world, respect the human rights of its own people, respect rule of law, let our poor human rights lawyers in China be able to work freely and help the people and help China to emerge as a country which respects human rights, which is able to work with its friends in the international community. But just then, as Senator Kiko said, there are all kinds of problems around the world, and many countries, including those in Asia, I guess including the Philippines, including our friends in Taiwan, they are very, very worried. And of course, our friends in India, in Indonesia, in other places too. So why should China behave in such a way? And some people say, oh, it's not China, it's the Communist Party. Because many Chinese people, they are just as helpless as ever. They are being suppressed as well. So, my dear friends, we in Hong Kong will continue with our shrinking freedom, with our shrinking space to defend our free lifestyle, our rule of law, and to fight for democracy. But we want to reach out to all of you and hope that you will speak, not just for Hong Kong, but for downtrodden people everywhere, because that's what we in COWD, we believe in. When we see people being suppressed, whether they're in Asia and elsewhere, we will speak out. Maybe, in the end, we have to make huge sacrifices. But so what? I mean, we only live once, and we want to make it worth living. So right now, it's a very trying time for Hong Kong because of the pandemic, which is getting worse because of poor policies of Carrie Lam. She's asking Beijing for help. And there is also some rumor that she may hold a meeting of the Executive Council today to postpone the Legislative Council election, which should be held on the 6th of September. And right now, I think over 100 people have registered to stand as candidates, including members from my own Democratic Party. But if Carrie Lam is going to announce this afternoon or later today that they will postpone the election for 1 year or for many months, that's outrageous. There were elections held in Singapore and also in South Korea. So why should Hong Kong postpone the election? And our medical and health experts have not offered such advice. I hope these people will continue to be independent, objective professionals who will not only tell Hong Kong people, but the international community what should be done here. We should not allow their political considerations to override all the health business. And so we are going through difficult times, my friends, but I certainly hope you can see in the coming months that Hong Kong people will not give up, we will not give in, but we will continue our struggle in a peaceful and non-violent way. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Emily, and keep safe, not only from the virus, but from the bigger threat. And we will call on now Kathy Chen, who will be our next speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Taipei, and I want to begin my talk by thanking COUD and MDI for the invitation to participate in this very important webinar. So I am tasked to speak a little bit about what's going on in Taiwan under the question, will Taiwan be next? It is very disconcerting following listening to Amelie's presentation on what was going on in Hong Kong. And believe me, the people of Taiwan, especially Taiwanese youth community, has been watching the development of Hong Kong for since last year with the anti-extradition law movement and marches and protests. And a lot of the Taiwanese are in support of Hong Kong people's quest to safeguard democracy and human rights for themselves. And of course, the Taiwanese government also expressed support for the Hong Kong people in their endeavor to secure democracy and safeguard the values that comes with the democratic system. So what about what's going on in Taiwan at the moment? As you might already know, Taiwan had a national presidential election back in January, right in the beginning or a little bit before the outbreak. So what happened was that President Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party won the second term by garnering the highest vote in Taiwan's democratic history, which is about a little bit over 8 million votes. That translates into about 57% of the popular vote of the voters. And of course, her political party, the Democratic Progressive Party, also won majority in Taiwan's parliament with 68 seats compared to the opposition of 35 seats. And there are also smaller parties in Taiwan that obtained votes in the Taiwanese legislature. So leading up to the Taiwanese general election, the happenings of Hong Kong, it's periodically as topic of discussion amongst candidates, both in legislature and of presidency, and also among civil society members that TFD works very close with. The shrinking democratic space of Hong Kong is an important issue for Taiwanese at the moment, because when it comes to safeguarding Taiwan's democracy, Taiwanese have been very much used to a democratic way of life, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, expression, press, very much leveled playing field when it comes to election, people signing up as political candidates, and also wanting to run for position down from the very basic borough chief position to, of course, the presidency. And so this enjoyment of democracy is not just a way of life in Taiwan, but for a lot of the younger generation who had always lived under a democratic system, it's part of Taiwanese identity as well. So Taiwanese being Democrats is something that it comes very natural. And people used to say, including Taiwanese president, saying that democracy and freedom for Taiwan is like breathing air. It's like breathing. But people will realize the preciousness of democracy if it were taken away. So, but that said, not only Taiwanese people are watching the development of Hong Kong, and there's several rallies already since last year around Taipei and around Taiwan in support of the democratic movement in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Taiwan has been, unfortunately, experiencing tremendous pressure from China, not just through militarily threats, but also influence operation, information warfare, trying to divide Taiwanese society by using disinformation, creating doubts, hopefully to influence the citizens' trust of their democratic elected government. So this is what's happening in Taiwan for the past 2-3 years. And of course, leading up to the national election, you see a hype of such behavior from China. So what Taiwan has been doing in order to not be next is that the Taiwanese government, and in conjunction of Taiwanese citizens, members of civil societies, have been coming together to trying to work towards the goal of safeguarding Taiwan's democracy and freedom. At the same time, also garnering support for from our democratic allies, international organizations that supports the furthering of democracy and human rights. Just brief examples. Since last year, Taiwanese government has been working to tweak the existing laws to beef up, if you may, Taiwan's national security. For example, there is the amendment of legislation how Taiwan would treat spies from the CCP and those who are working as proxies or trying to garner information for the Chinese Communist Party. And also, there's new legislation under the national security legislation on how to treat an individual if he or she assists the Chinese Communist Party to develop organizations that supports the CCP's intent to infringe and interfere with Taiwan's democracy. And also, there's legislations that were passed preventing or limiting high-ranking military officials from traveling to the PRC to attend political activities. And of course, towards the end of 2019, the legislature in Taiwan also passed security law that is monitoring proxies for the communist regime. That said, the Taiwanese legislators and also administration knew that these legislations has to be well discussed and managed very carefully in order to safeguard Taiwan from its neighbors' infringement. But at the same time, it's also really important for the Taiwanese administration to still safeguard the people's democratic way of life and also their freedom, while safeguarding what they enjoy so much. This is also when Taiwan's vibrant civil society and members of the civic organizations come in, and also in their work with Taiwan's, for example, Taiwan's digital minister, Ms. Audrey Tang, to safeguard the cyberspace. And there are quite a few organizations that the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy works for, works with, that use fact check mechanisms when it comes and to dispute disinformation, and they do it in very fast manner. And also, the Taiwanese administration under the Executive Yuan also have I would say a rule or a habit to dispute disinformation as quickly as within 2 hours of finding out a piece of disinformation existed. So organizations such as Watch Out, Doublethink Lab, and Taiwan Fact Check Institution, Fact Check Center, also instrumental when it comes to defending Taiwan's democratic way of life and disputing information warfare. So will Taiwan be next? Although I cannot predict the future, but what I could tell you is while supporting our partners and colleagues in Hong Kong in their endeavor to pursue and safeguard democracy, the Taiwanese people, Taiwanese civic organizations, civil society, including Taiwan's administration, will do our best and will do all we can so Taiwan can remain a democratic, self-sufficient, and independent country. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for bringing us up to date on Taiwan's activities. But these have been started long ago to safeguard freedom and democracy. May we now call on our next speaker, joining us from Washington, D.C., Manpreet.
Great. Well, first, let me just say it's a real pleasure to partner with CALD on this important webinar for this very timely topic. And I wanted to start off by describing what we see as kind of some of the major political developments across Asia from the perspective of some of the actions that Beijing has taken over the recent past. You know, what we're witnessing is an increasingly assertive Beijing. An assertive Beijing where it's trying to grow its influence across the region, but in particular, trying to shore up its territorial control. You know, in Xinjiang, there are upwards of 1 million Uyghurs who have been arbitrarily detained in re-education camps. In Tibet, there's a new law for ethnic unity that in essence really seeks to dilute Tibetan identity and culture. In Hong Kong, where we just heard from esteemed speaker about how the national security law really has fundamentally broken Beijing's promise to operate as in one country, two systems. And then, of course, as Ketty just talked about in terms of Taiwan and whether it's next on the list. But it's not just about its own territorial control. We've seen even beyond its borders or right on its borders, Beijing taking a much more offensive posture. In Nepal, the Chinese ambassador has been criticized for making statements seen as threatening Nepali citizens' rights to free speech and free press, as we've seen interfering in internal politics. The opening speaker talked about the conflict on the disputed border between India and China and how that escalated last month, and yet another flashpoint between two regional powers. In Southeast Asia, we're seeing leaders embrace China and its policies as a way to garner greater investment. Most notably, we've seen this in Cambodia and the Philippines, as we've seen leaders there emulate Xi's strongman approach. What's interesting, though, that it's not just about Beijing trying to simply expand its influence across geographies. It's also about diversifying its methods of influence. And this is where we are seeing exports of technology and surveillance systems to authoritarians around the world. And even though it's doing it differently than Russia, China is now expanding its digital footprint as a way to shift and change narratives and spread disinformation, especially through online platforms, which, as all of us know, has become a go-to tool for authoritarian regimes to try to sow distrust in democracies. And then finally, of course, on the economic side, the Belt and Road Initiative, other trade and investment means that Beijing has sought to utilize to push its own political agenda. So then the apt question, which is the question on the screen right now, is how must the global community of democrats respond? And it's an important and timely question. There's of course not one answer to it. What I thought I would do is spend a few minutes talking through how NDI is approaching these developments and how we're trying to answer this question. And it starts with what is it that we're seeking to achieve? And first and foremost, we're focused on our mission. That is expanding citizen participation, strengthening democratic institutions, having more inclusive and accountable ways to meet citizens' needs, increasing transparency in government and political processes. This is part of our mission because we know as democracies face threats from various authoritarian actors, we'll have to mitigate against these malign influences. And that is going to be critical to how we conduct our work and whether or not we're going to be successful. But I do want to emphasize that as an international development organization, we certainly do not seek to partake in some of the greater geopolitical games that have been played, whether it's between the United States and China or other powers. It's really important that we distinguish between a country's citizens and its government, that we seek to try to elevate and amplify and empower those voices, especially that are marginalized or repressed, but those voices that are pro-democracy. And this is all to say that we are not anti-China. We are rather trying to promote an agenda that is about pro-democracy practices and bringing democratic resilience. So how do we do this? Well, of course, have to be focused on the democracy and human rights and governance space. And while economic and kind of geopolitical issues certainly touch on in this sector, really the question is about how to strengthen and support democracies. And this means all sorts of things. This means providing support and convening opportunities to establish democracies, to help them confront the anti-democratic forces within their own borders. It also means providing technical assistance to transitioning democracies on how they can help build better systems that are robust, responsive, that are resilient. And especially in the Asia-Pacific region, providing technical assistance wherever possible, but also solidarity to those who are fighting for democracy and looking to amplify their voices to the international community. This all rests, of course, on increasing transparency and accountability. Those are critical components of the work to be done and will be important in answering this overall question. So how can we do this? Well, the previous speakers talked about some channels that China is using to undermine democracy, such as in the tech and media space to spread disinformation. And we certainly are investing a lot of time and energy in that space. For example, we at NDI, we convened the Design for Democracy Coalition, which brings together civic technology activists or CivTech community, as well as representatives from the technology and social media platforms to share information and try to co-build strategies. I think the partnership that Ketty mentioned about Taiwan CivTech community is a fantastic example of how that community and government can work together to improve digital transparency. It's a model, frankly, not just for the region, but for the world. And we're proud to be working with some of those partners. The other thing that we all ought to be thinking about is how we can support coalitions of like-minded democracies, again, so that we can build solidarity, we can come together, we can share tools and knowledge about what's happening within each country and also across the region. This helps to create, frankly, a different kind of united front, if you will, on the global stage to confront Beijing's attempts to co-opt international organizations or institutions. Of course, along with working with more established democracies, we also have to monitor those who may be more vulnerable, those countries that are transitioning into democracies or experiencing democratic backsliding, or frankly, countries that have autocratic leaders or are susceptible because of the huge development or investment needs that they have. And we are doing this all through the different types of programming that I mentioned before, but at its heart is working to strengthen democratic institutions. Finally, let me end with talking about the impact of or potential impact of the upcoming U.S. elections. And I need to start by saying, as representing NDI, NDI is a nonpartisan, non-governmental organization. We work with a wide range of partners around the world. We do not pick sides or outcomes. And as I mentioned before, we're all about supporting democratic processes and institutions and structures in various governments. But just because we are nonpartisan, that doesn't mean that politics don't affect our work. And as tensions mount between the United States and China, especially ahead of the upcoming US presidential election, NDI and other democracy non-government organizations have found themselves as targets. There is, of course, bipartisan consensus here in the United States that the leadership in China has become more outwardly aggressive. There's an impulse to punish anyone who speaks out for democracy and human rights. They try to tie their trade benefits to towing the party line. They try to use traditional and digital influence in malign ways. Over the years, this has impacted NDI as well. Beijing, just late last year, threatened to sanction NDI, falsely claiming that we were an arm of the U.S. government. But what we're seeing now is that the current U.S. administration has taken what it describes as a tough stance on China. Though its strategic rationale, frankly, seems to be driven largely for electoral politics rather than specific policy goals. But rhetoric along these lines may only become sharper leading up to the US election. And amid these tensions, I do worry about the fallout, not just from a geopolitical perspective, but also what that means for NGOs, for pro-democracy actors. We already know that NDI and similar organizations are in the crosshairs of Beijing. Might we also now be caught in the crossfire between the US and China? Only time will tell. But as we work through these challenges, we'll remain focused on our core work and committed to supporting democracy across the region as we do around the world. We'll do it transparently, openly, inclusively. We'll, of course, prioritize the safety of those that we work with, and we'll remain focused on our mission. And as we do it, we'll continue to seek the support of partners in the region, such as those that are on this webinar, to be vigilant against these threats. Because this is no more important time to be working on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Manpreet, for your provocative thoughts and very informative as well. We will see in the open forum, discuss in the open forum later. May I now introduce our reactors, and I will introduce them in the order of their presentation. Cherry Wong is the Executive Director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong, of which she is a founding member. The Alliance is a newly launched collective to mobilize and empower Canada-Hong Kong community groups to take political action. Cherry joins us from Canada. After Cherry, we will have Richard Heydarian, a columnist of the Philippine Daily Inquirer and a political analyst of the GMA TV network. He has taught political science at the De La Salle University and the Ateneo de Manila University. He is author of a number of books on the Philippines and geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region. Richard joins us from Manila. So let us listen first to Cherry.
Thank you for having me. I think to start, we should kind of look at the one country, two system principle. Starting from when I was young, very young, the first thought I ever had on the one country, two system is what happens after the 50 years? What is Hong Kong's future beyond the 50 years, 2047? But it was becoming clear to me as I was growing up that that principle was no longer, it no longer applies to the situation of Hong Kong because it has faced a slow deterioration over the years. We see a similar article being proposed by the Hong Kong government back in 2003, Article 23. After 500,000 people marched, the government withdrew the bill. But again, in 2019, we saw the introduction of the anti-extradition movement, targeting specifically at extradition to China. And until now, we see this new national security law as basically ending one country, two system as we know it. So I think it has definitely accelerated in recent years. And it's something that we need to keep in mind when we think about Hong Kong's future, because this one country, two system principle no longer applies to Hong Kong. It is in fact a fantasy to think that we can remain in the framework of one country, two system. And looking ahead, I think what we need to talk about is really Hong Kong people's autonomy. So even at the handover and prior to the handover in 1984, the Joint Declaration came together without the consultation of the Hong Kong people. So to begin with, we were handed from one colonizer to another imperialist. The Chinese Communist Party took over Hong Kong while in the early years, Hong Kong's autonomy was able to remain intact. It's clear that that will not be the same way from now on. We see not just in Hong Kong, but we see in Tibet, we see in East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang, that China does not stop at, is not planning to stop. Their plan to take over their own territories is beyond borders, beyond international norms, but it's actually a complete takeover, not just in the geopolitical space of Southeast Asia. And looking at Taiwan, we can't examine Taiwan in the same lens because Taiwan has always been an independent democratic country away from China, despite they would not want to admit so. So when we look at Taiwan's future, we have to examine it under the lens that how can Taiwan remain independent and democratic while getting accepted in the international community, which is, I think, a question that many Taiwanese folks have been asking and demanding an answer for. Under the current trajectory, I think it's important for every world actor to look at Hong Kong, look at Tibet, look at East Turkestan, and look at the conflicts happening in South China Sea as these are events that are repeatedly proving to us that China doesn't plan to bend the rules. They actually plan to rewrite the global order in favor of their imperialist agenda. Of course, like their influence campaign is beyond just political or on borders. We see it in media. We see it a people-to-people relationship. And as mentioned by a lot of the panelists here, One Belt, One Road, investments, students, there are multiple ways that China is influencing the global order. And it is time for Western societies, Western democratic societies to step up, because these are issues that are at our doorsteps, and we can't expect it to go away. We can't expect it to soften. Instead, as long as we remain in a soft position, China will keep on advancing their global authoritarian agenda. I think another thing is like there's a unique role that middle powers like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, the EU, like these countries can take. So Hong Kong and Taiwan obviously exist outside of the China-US relationship. Though these are two global superpowers that are competing against each other, we have to look at the roles that middle countries can play. And these roles will not be as direct or as strong as we may see on the outside. Instead, we need to expand on our soft powers and really examine how we can influence the democratization of developing countries as well as of China, Hong Kong, and its associated territories. The unique ways to engage in China, there are many of them, but some of the things that have been mentioned already is multilateral approach. China has been painting itself into a corner for many years. It has created this fictional Cold War, whether with the United States or with Western democracies. So as they paint themselves into this corner where it is the CCP versus the world needs to take advantage of that narrative and say, yes, we unite on principles of human rights, on democratic values, and we stand against China's authoritarian rule. Another approach is through economic and trade, so divestment, banning, and sanctioning companies as well as individuals who are associated with the Chinese Communist Party. We've heard calls for sanction from the United States. We've heard calls of sanction from different foreign affairs ministers across the world. While sanction is one of the ways, we need to look at the variety of ways we can hold China as well as its officials accountable. I think one of the other more important factors we need to consider is how can we create an Indo-Pacific strategy that encompasses all the things that are happening in not just China, but its associated regions, its disputes on borders, as well as its military advances across Southeast Asia. So this Indo-Pacific strategy will require collaboration and cooperation between multiple countries. And these will have to be middle powers taking the lead because there's definitely special interests between the US and China. So middle powers need to take a leadership role in building soft power in that region. And one of the things that I think middle powers need to start looking into is actually investing in developing countries and countries who have interests to break away from the CCP control. We know that the Chinese Communist Party uses investment and economic benefits to draw in collaboration and cooperation from other countries. So we need to cut them off their power at its source. Instead of trading economic benefits with developing countries, we as democratic and Western society actually need to offer developing countries a way out, an alternative, an investment plan that does not ultimately require you to bend to the rules of autocratic country, but instead actually encourages the democratization of the country, encourages the development of human rights and democratic values. I think wrapping up is just looking at Hong Kong as a Hong Konger. We need to look beyond the confines of one country, two system and the joint declaration. It's clear that China has no intention of following through with the joint declaration. So it is a fantasy that we still want to return to this model that was given to us by the UK and by the Chinese Communist Party. Instead, looking beyond that, we need to look at what do the Hong Kong people want. We cannot claim what the majority of Hong Kong people want without having a vote. And we know that Hong Kong people are interested to develop a democracy that belongs to us. So with that in mind, I actually am a strong believer that Hong Kong must look at self-determination. What is our future beyond the Chinese Communist Party? What is our future beyond the autocratic control from Beijing? Thank you.
Thank you, Cherry. And we will talk about, I'm sure, self-determination later in the open forum. I'd like to call on our next reactor, Richard Heydarian.
For the kind invitation, I'm just trying to make sure I'm on time. We have only 5 to 10 minutes. Yep. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm actually learning a lot, and I've been I think I bumped into some of the folks who spoke earlier, especially folks in Taiwan. I spent some time in Taiwan as visiting scholar last year, and of course, Emily Lau. I've been following her commentaries on Hong Kong, among others. And this issue of China's policy, not only within the so-called Greater China, but in the region and beyond, is something very close to my heart. And as a Filipino, of course, I believe that this has also a lot of impact for our political system and the future of our democracy. In fact, so much so that I'm almost obsessed on the question of China. I just finished a book in the Pacific on the China-US issue. I'm already working on 2 additional books. And one of the books, I'm actually looking at Taiwan and Hong Kong as some sort of frontline stories and what are the lessons that we can learn. So 4 points very quickly on the issues that were raised by the speakers earlier. First of all, I last night I was really thinking deeply about this, and in retrospect, I think our declaration of the end of Cold War in 1989 was absolutely premature, because for anyone who understands China's Tiananmen episode and how the Deng Xiaoping and other administration look at the experience of the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party has done everything possible to make sure that it survives longer and it's more prosperous and more powerful than Soviet Union. So they learned a lot of lessons from what happened in Russia, including the fact that you should not open yourself politically in terms of glasnost and perestroika. So I myself and a lot of pundits have used the term new Cold War. But if you look at it, I believe what we're really looking at now is the real Cold War. I think the Soviet threat to the West was never as large as people thought compared to what we're facing from China right now. I think Soviet Union was just a curtain raiser, a kind of preview of the kind of a real Cold War that we're seeing from China, because China is a true peer of the United States. Economically, it's going to have a GDP that is going to be larger than the United States in the foreseeable future. And unlike the Soviet Union, I mean, China is not only economically vibrant and militarily increasingly powerful, but is also dominating cutting-edge technologies. So if you look at analysis of folks who are very much familiar with artificial intelligence and 5G and cutting-edge technology, China is already dominating a lot of these fields. So the Chinese are a threat to the Western order in ways that Soviet Union never was. And that brings me to the second issue. I think if you look at the case of Hong Kong, it should also have served as an eye-opener that when it comes to the Chinese statecraft, you cannot separate geopolitics from economics. A lot of people are saying, well, Hong Kong is so financially important that China will never try to compromise the position of Hong Kong, and that even though China is developing the so-called Greater Bay Area in the Guangdong area, Hong Kong will always be special because of not only its hard infrastructure, but soft infrastructure. And yet, we saw what happened over the past few weeks and months, whereby China has clearly put geopolitics and the party interests and party ideology beyond the economics. And we saw that the Chinese government actually mobilized the Chinese incorporation, the big companies in China. It pushed for infusion of capital in the Hong Kong stock markets. It made everything, it really softened the ground for the kind of takeover that we have seen in Hong Kong, which just 6 months, 8 months, a year ago was almost unthinkable. When I was in protests in Hong Kong and talking to the students, I think few of those students or protesters or experts I talked in Hong Kong would have thought that this is possible. We were more thinking of a kind of a Tiananmen-like showdown if things continue as they were. And now here we are, China taking over and making sure that the economic blow is not as strong because of their sophisticated statecraft and ability to mobilize the big Chinese companies to come and save the day financially and economically in the case of Hong Kong. So this is really troubling because here in the Philippines, for instance, among other countries, you have a leadership which always says, well, when it comes to China, we can separate geopolitics, we can separate South China Sea disputes, and then we can focus on economic issues, on investment, among other things. But I think clearly, as we see in the case of Hong Kong, we may try to treat those two issues separately. The Americans tried to treat that separately since the Clinton era, but that ended during the Trump era. But the Chinese do not see it that way. They completely treat geopolitics and economics as entwined, and they're willing to sacrifice economics and trade and globalization for the party interests, for their geopolitical interests. And I think this should have served as a wake-up call. And the third important issue, I think this is where Taiwan is, in my opinion, not getting as much attention as it deserves. So last year, I got a chance to talk to senior officials, including President Tsai, among others, on how Taiwan is dealing with the threat from China. And for me, it's remarkable how, first of all, the events in Hong Kong influence developments in Taiwan. President Tsai's numbers were not looking very good early in 2019, and yet she pulled off a very dominant election victory. Mayor Han, the out of nowhere, outside the box populist in Taiwan, is now even out of office. So the backlash against China is very strong. So first of all, you can see the Taiwan events and Hong Kong events are very much interrelated. But I think what was really interesting in the case of Taiwan was how they balance their counter influence operations when it comes to Chinese interference, and at the same time preserving the fundamentals of their democracy. And I think this has a lot of ramifications, including for us in the Philippines, because, today experts no longer talk about soft power, or the attraction of your culture and values, nor hard power alone, meaning the strength of your military. People are now talking about sharp power. And sharp power is specifically the tools that countries like Russia and China use in order to sow discord and divisions within democracy. And we saw how Taiwan was so vulnerable back in 2018 during the midterm elections when President Tsai didn't do well. But guess what? They learned a lesson from that. They pushed for necessary regulations to push back against espionage activities and disinformation campaign by China, cutting all across society, including social media influencers. And at the end of the day, they won. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from Taiwan in terms of balancing our democratic freedoms on one hand, and at the same time making sure that we can preserve our sovereignty and push back against the sharp power from China. And that brings me to the last issue, which I think is relevant because, one of the frustrating things that I kept on hearing going around the world, especially talking to Western journalists and sometimes policymakers, is this kind of a fatalism, this idea that China has dominated much of Asia, we just have to deal with them, let's see how we can move forward. Now I'm seeing that finally some people are realizing that the game is far from over. And as a Filipino, we are known for boxers. And I think if this is boxing, this is just round 3 and 4, and a lot can change and there's no knockout yet. I mean, to begin with, everyone is talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative and how it's going to change the world, it's going to dominate the world. Guess what? In the Philippines, for instance, as I repeatedly said over the past few years, China is going to promise billions of dollars. But where are the investments from China? I think as of today, in the 5th year of President Duterte in office, 0 big-ticket infrastructure projects from China. And this story has been replicated all across the world, while in other countries like Sri Lanka and Malaysia, they have been pushing back on the debt trap issue. So I think the influence of China has been overblown when it comes to economic influence, but you have misguided leaders who are giving a lot of geopolitical concessions in exchange for imaginary buck and imaginary investments. And it's that kind of mindless leadership and naive geopolitics, including here in the Philippines, that we should avoid. The other thing is that we also saw that some of the Chinese national champions like Huawei and ZTE, how vulnerable they were. So just a few years ago, the idea that China will dominate the next phase of technology and 5G information and artificial intelligence was a foregone conclusion. And there was a lot of depression in the West that they didn't do enough in terms of trade and industrial policy to push back. And yet, as soon as the Trump administration imposed sanctions, as soon as anti-China sentiments increased in Britain, among others, we see that Huawei is very much in trouble because a lot of the Chinese companies rely a lot on technological inputs and cooperation with their Western counterparts. So as dominant as China is looking in terms of cutting-edge technology in ways the Soviet Union never was, China is also way more vulnerable, and that means there's a lot of point of intervention and pushback by the West if the West is organized along with allies. And we see that Japan is already developing an alternative 5G, and South Korea is already looking at 6G. I heard that the Vietnamese are developing their own 5G. So there's so much room here to make sure that we clip the nefarious part of Chinese influence while engaging China on areas whereby it's truly mutually respectful and mutually beneficial. The other thing is, of course, the issue of authoritarian blitzkrieg. We clearly see, I think Rahm Emanuel said something like, never let a crisis go to waste. And obviously, not only China, but authoritarian populists across the region have been using the pandemic to push for an authoritarian agenda. But the reality is that public opinion against China is shifting significantly, whether it's in Australia or in the Philippines or in Taiwan or in the United States. And, the pandemic will not be here forever. And I think as soon as this dust a little bit settles, hopefully by next year, we will see more and more popular and civil society pushback, which brings me to my last point. If you look at it, we are not in the same world anymore. As much as China may look like they're having the upper hand, the pushback is gaining strength so much. No matter who wins the elections in the US in November, our understanding based on, dealing with folks in Washington, D.C. and regularly visiting the U.S. and looking at the debates there is that we're looking at a bipartisan consensus almost in the U.S. that the kind of engagement that the Clinton and Obamas and the Bush administration are pushing for, that engagement track is not working. Something different has to be done. Maybe not the way Trump is doing it, but I think in terms of tactics, we can make adjustments, although the strategy should really differ. We're also seeing that the quadrilateral alliance is strengthening among Australia, India, Japan, and United States in ways that was unthinkable, again, a year or two ago because of China's brazen opportunism. We see that even Wall Street and big hedge fund companies are pushing back against, China's leveraging of globalization and its trade influence to influence American foreign policy. And we also see that educational institutions, civil society groups are pushing back. So all I'm saying here is that as difficult and dreary and gloomy as things seem, we're still in early rounds of this fight, and there's so much to be done. And the end game here is not to be anti-China. The end game here is to constrain the worst instincts of China by realism and by collective pushback. And that's definitely what we need. And we needed this way earlier, but it's good to finally see a degree of awakening and this growing solidarity among us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. And we'll now open the floor for questions. And there are, I just like to remind those who want to ask questions to just post them on Facebook. Please state whom you want to be, please state the person whom you want to answer your question. And of course, I will ask our speakers to answer these and also to be brief. And just like to inform you that Senator Pangilinan will be staying with us till the end of this webinar, so he'll be able to entertain questions. Now, I'm going to read 3 questions, and I'll read them all together and then ask you to answer it, and I'll determine, I will specify who will answer these questions. First, from Sky Gamban, I think this will go to Senator Pangilinan. I think this question is for him. Are there any similarities between the Hong Kong security law and the Philippines anti-terror bill? If so, what are the implications of this for the current political situation of the Philippines? And how can we citizens prepare for what is to come? So that's for Senator Pangilinan. The next question from Anton Hilado is for Ketty Chen. While Hong Kong still recognizes the one country, two systems, Taiwan does not. So how will this difference come into play with the Taiwan-Hong Kong cooperation? I think both Ketty and Emily can answer this. And the third question is from Harun Mahadi. It's directed to Manpreet. Do you think that the recent tensions between China and India will change South Asia's political dimension? Is democracy in South Asia under threat? Okay, very interesting questions. So do we start with Senator Pangilinan? Are you still here?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, the question directed to you then on the securities of the Philippines and China. Hong Kong.
I must admit I've not been able to go through the Hong Kong the laws, the anti-terror laws of Hong Kong. But I've been monitoring what's been happening in Hong Kong, and actually the thing that struck me is that there were public statements to the effect in Hong Kong that the pro-democracy rallyists have been branded as terrorists, and therefore possibly subjected precisely to the national security laws there. In the same context, the Philippine setting, the fear is that the anti-terror law will then be used to go against or go after legitimate dissent and criticism. Vagueness and of the law itself lends to possible abuse and various interpretations. In fact, what's disturbing is that the National Security Advisor in the Philippines said, for as long as if they remain silent, then they shouldn't be afraid. That's he used the Filipino term, manahimik. Kung sila'y tahimik, hindi dapat maproblema. Meaning, if they remain silent, then there should be no issue. And that's very disturbing. So it really, under the context of authoritarianism and undemocratic regimes, an anti-terror law and a national security law will always lend to abuses or stifling of dissent and criticism. Saying one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Nelson Mandela was jailed for 27 years because of his opposition to apartheid. And yet, as far as that government was concerned, he was a terrorist and deserved to be in jail for 27 years. And obviously, history unfolded in South Africa led to his vindication. And that's the fear, that we will be oppressed, we will be harassed, and it'll be used to precisely run after us and go after us, as it had happened already under the Marcos regime, the dictatorship from 1972 to 1986.
Okay, thank you, Senator. The next question, I think Katie first and then Emily. It's about the one country, two systems, and how will this difference come into play with the Taiwan-Hong Kong cooperation?
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, yeah, the Taiwanese government does not recognize or will adhere to the one country, two system. And President Tsai has already iterated several times that this is not the desire of the Taiwanese people, that Taiwanese people's democratic way of life should be honored, and the future of Taiwan should be determined by the 23 million Taiwanese people. So that's what I would say the basis or to save for Taiwan's democracy at this moment. That said, Taiwan does have laws and regulation regarding Hong Kong and Macau affairs that under the Mainland Affairs Council, that's the legal basis for maintaining relations with Hong Kong. And also recently, after the passage of the National Security Law, the Taiwanese government established a non-government organization called the Taiwan-Hong Kong Service Exchange Office. That is a all-encompassing office that assists the people of Hong Kong when it comes to education, relocation, investments to Taiwan. So it just I think the establishment of the office happened just a few weeks ago on the 2nd of July. So that's the most current development of how Taiwan is to maintain relationship with Hong Kong and also the people of Hong Kong.
Okay, Emily, would you like to answer that as well?
Thank you. I always understand Taiwanese people do not want one country, two systems. In fact, way back in 2002, at a seminar organized by former President Lee Teng-hui and elsewhere, I said, regarding the future of Taiwan, I think it's up to the Taiwanese people. And for that, of course, I've been attacked by the communist media and others in Hong Kong for 2 years. So, well, I respect the Taiwanese people to fight for their future. And in Hong Kong's case, of course, Hong Kong people will fight, but they understand the confines. And that's why I welcome Taiwan's decision to welcome Hong Kong people to go to Taiwan and to go to the UK who hold the BNO passport and to go elsewhere. I hope our friends in the international community will welcome Hong Kong people who want to leave Hong Kong. And those who want to fight, of course, they will carry on. But I don't think too many of them want to make huge sacrifices yet. And so it is a very difficult situation. And we have an election coming up. We will let the candidates, the parties speak for the people, and we hope the election will be held. And just then I saw on the news that some of the banks are closing down the accounts of some of the government or pro-Beijing officials and members of the Executive Council. So they are all closing in on us. The banks may close my accounts too and do all sorts of things. So the space is shrinking. And we hope our friends in Taiwan and elsewhere will speak out for us, and we will continue to fight. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Emily. The third question for Manpreet, please. Do you think the recent tensions between China and India will change South Asia's political dimensions? Is democracy in South Asia under threat?
Yeah, well, thank you, Haroon. It's good to hear from you since we were both in Dhaka a couple of years ago. Good questions. The short answer to your first question there about recent tensions between China and India changing South Asia's political dimensions, I mean, not particularly is my thought. I mean, I think it reflects more about the bilateral relationship between India and China than it does about political dimensions across the subcontinent. It is yet to be seen, however, how China's growing assertiveness, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, across the subcontinent will manifest itself, and therefore what India's reaction will be to that. But I don't know that the recent tensions and the border dispute necessarily trickle down to other parts of South Asia there. Your second question, I think, is the really important one. And it's about whether democracy is under threat in South Asia. And I would say in many cases it is, but maybe not for the reason that we're talking about here. It's not always the foreign dimension. Increasingly, we're seeing single party rules, without a vibrant opposition, which is not good for democracy, no matter your political leanings. We are seeing media houses and media channels and platforms be completely controlled either by ruling governments or various political parties or factions, in which you just see propaganda outlets more than the free flow of information, which does not help to inform the citizenry. You don't see adequate oversight. So more power is being accumulated by the center and by the executive across various South Asian countries, with limited oversight in order to have those kinds of checks and balances. And marginalized populations in each of these countries, whether it's based on ethnic or religious or linguistic lines, continue to be highly marginalized. So I do think that democracy is under threat for various reasons across South Asia, but much of it is actually internal in these countries. That's not to diminish the growing concern around foreign influence, around elections in particular. There is not great transparency into how funding flows go into elections and campaigns in many of these countries, and I think it is very susceptible to foreign influence, and so that is very much a concern. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to read two questions, one for Cherry and one for Richard, so that we still have some time. For Cherry, the question is, have you heard of the US initiative, the Blue Dot Network? And how do you feel it as an alternative to the One Belt, One Road initiative when it comes to low interest loans to developing countries for their projects? And for Richard, there's a follow-up of Sky on Sky wants to know also your opinion, your thoughts on the Hong Kong national security law as compared to the Philippines anti-terror law. So let's take these two questions first and then proceed to the next questions should we have time. So Cherry?
Yeah, so I did a little quick search on the Blue Dot Network. So linking the public, private, and civil sectors to give out low interest loans is definitely an alternative to One Belt, One Road. But we have to look at it, is it an equal relationship? Is it the loan, does it happen outside and beyond the confines of imperial interests? If so, is it a loan that upholds human rights, the values that we are holding dear, while investing in our global community? So it's definitely a great initiative, but we need to see more of it. It's not just the US's responsibility, but it is all of our countries, the middle powers I listed, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, the EU. Like, we all have a responsibility to our global neighbors. And I think we need to start thinking about China beyond the US-China superpower complex. It's actually about all of our responsibilities as global citizens, and how can the global community support developing countries who are being coerced into these relationships that are not equal with China.
Okay, Richard, can you take this question? Your thoughts on the national security law of Hong Kong and our own Anti-Terror Act?
Yeah, very quickly, because I also ate a little bit of time. Like, first of all, let me go back again to the BRI issue, because this is very important. One of the misconceptions people have is that China dominates the infrastructure development picture, particularly in places like Southeast Asia. But guess what? If you look at the numbers, it's not China, it is still Japan that leads major projects across the region. In places like Vietnam and places like the Philippines, Japan is leading by far, and there's not even a competition between the two sides. So I think the way forward is, first of all, not to try to match China dollar on dollar, assuming the Chinese money will even come in. But I think it's also important that you have coordination between different countries. The Australians and ASEAN had an initiative. The Singaporeans want to bring initiatives to allow private companies to put money in the infrastructure landscape. The Japanese are already a leading player. The Trump administration had the $60 billion BUILD initiative. Now, each of these initiatives, there are lots of problems with them, but I think the coordination of all of them is important. But the fundamental message here is that it's not only about getting money to build up your infrastructure. It's about making sure that the money that comes in doesn't create corruption, doesn't undermine your fiscal stability, doesn't undermine your sovereignty, and doesn't destroy your environment. So this is more a question of rule of law and values rather than just money coming from China. And as I said, if as far as the BRI is concerned, it's more promise than reality so far, perhaps for the better. And then on the question of national security law and the anti-terror bill law in the Philippines, let's not forget it happened in the same week. So, the half joke is that maybe President Duterte is, coordinating it with China. We don't know, of course. That's a half joke or probably a full joke. But the reality is this. I think we have to wake up from this delusion that dictatorship in the 21st century, authoritarianism in the 21st century is going to be like the 20th century, whereby you have a coup d'etat, you have a declaration of martial law, and then democracy is dead. That's not how democracy dies. Now, democracy dies by what political scientists call rule by law, not rule of law. Rule of law is when the law applies to everyone, including the president, the head of state, equally and predictably based on conventional and reasonable interpretation of the law. Rule by law is when you weaponize extremely vague legal regulations, stipulations, executive orders, and new laws, in the case of anti-terror law, to actually selectively target a particular group, whether it's opposition, activist groups, among others. So I think what we're seeing right now is authoritarian learning and the specter of usage of rule by law to actually undermine our democracies. And we have to learn from countries who are effectively able to fight back against that. Perhaps we can have a different webinar for that. But I think at least this is a wake-up call. Rule by law is one of the biggest enemies of democracy in the 21st century.
Thank you. I'll take one question because it's a big one, and I will ask some of you to answer it. The question is from Dale Rivera. May we clarify U.S. policy regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan? Can we say that U.S. became lax in extending its influence or help over Hong Kong, and will Taiwan expect U.S. as its ally when push comes to shove? And another question. So this is just one big question: is there a projected foreign policy shift now that elections is coming soon? So maybe Manpreet, would you like to answer this since you're based there in Washington, D.C., and then we can ask Richard or Katie and Emily to pitch in.
Sure. I'll have to be careful here. So there, it is a series of good questions. I would say, in terms of whether or not the U.S. has become lax, I don't know that it's about the U.S. becoming lax or not. I think there are real questions about the coherence of the current strategy and the rationale of the strategy towards China. Lots of criticisms around this administration looking at China primarily, if not completely, through a trade lens, and not employing the traditional tools of diplomacy or foreign policy to be able to pursue its stated goals. That could mean multilateralism, joining with other like-minded countries to face these types of threats to democracy. And so when you ask about, is there a projected foreign policy shift? I assume you mean if there's a new administration, a different administration under Vice President Biden. I think you could safely say yes. I mean, Vice President Biden has been very clear about what his foreign policy would look like. He's given speeches on this, and of course he has a previous record that would embrace multilateralism, that would look at how you could work with other countries to solve global challenges, to face various threats, and that it would be a foreign policy driven by national interest and national security, and not solely through the lens of trade or protectionism, or in some cases, frankly, nativism. And so, yes, I think we would see a projected foreign policy shift if there was a new administration. I will say, and this is just to quickly end, there is strong bipartisan support within the United States for maintaining our robust and strong relationship with Taiwan, and I don't see that changing in the future.
Thank you. Katie, would you like to answer the part wherein Taiwan expects US as an ally when push comes to shove? I think this is related to the other question: if will US come to your aid if there is a military confrontation with China?
I want to echo Manfred's last comment about strong bipartisan support for Taiwan and Taiwan's democracy. We have seen that through different U.S. administration, from President Obama's administration to President Trump's administration. In the past couple of years, there is even closer relations between the U.S. government and Taiwanese government, in addition to very close active relationship between U.S. organizations and Taiwanese organizations, and our respective partners in civil society. So I really, I really agree that the strong support, and I'm very happy to learn and know that the bipartisan support of Taiwan is going on strong, and in the next few years, that will not change. And on the Taiwan side, Taiwan is really eager and has already working with U.S. administrations and members of civil society to create this really important, strong bond between democracies. So, so this is my opinion on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Can you say a few words about U.S. policy towards Hong Kong? Was it lax in extending its influence over Hong Kong?
Well, I think what I would like to say is I'm grateful to the international community for focusing so much on tiny little Hong Kong in the past year. I mean, the coverage that we have received made some countries quite jealous, because the human rights violations in those places are a lot worse. And they cannot understand why Hong Kong kept dominating, the news media. So I would just like to call on all our friends in the international community to continue to focus on Hong Kong, to speak out for us, to speak out not just for Hong Kong, but for human rights, for rule of law, for democracy, struggle everywhere. And we in Hong Kong, we will reach out to other places too, to support them, whether it's in the Philippines, in Thailand, and in other places who are fighting very hard. So we will all do our part. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Emily. Wow, we've discussed a lot of things this morning. I think it's about time to close the forum, and I hope there will be more discussions in the coming, in the future. I would like now to invite Celito or Lito Arlegui, the Executive Director of to give the closing remarks. Lito.
Thank you so much, Marites. We started this webinar with the question, will the dark clouds over Hong Kong soon engulf the rest of Asia? To a certain extent, we can say that they already have. In the Philippines, we talk about the anti-terror law. In Singapore, we have the POPMA, or the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. And in Cambodia, they recently enacted a state of emergency law that attempted to address the pandemic, but has been used to crack down on the opposition. The reality is that majority of the countries in Southeast Asia can be classified as enduring authoritarian regimes. Having said that, we cannot deny that many liberals and Democrats in the region and outside are strongly pushing back. We have heard from Emily, who said that Hong Kongers refuse to be silenced. We heard from Katie, who argued that Taiwan is doing its best to safeguard its democratic way of life. And it also helps that the Taiwanese breathe freedom as if it's air. And of course, Manfred also pointed out that other organizations, including the NDI, have been promoting transparency and accountability in order to counter this rise of authoritarianism. Because we have this very brave liberals and Democrats across the region and beyond, I can say that there is still much hope for Asian democracy. On behalf of the organizers, please allow me to thank all the speakers, the reactors, and of course our moderator, Marites. Most importantly, thank you to those who watch us on Facebook in the past 1 hour and a half. Until next time.
Thank you. I just want to make an announcement before we all go. The third webinar in this series, we look at the 2020 US elections. And the question is, will it matter for human rights and democracy in Asia? And this is scheduled for late August. I think, Manpreet, we may see you there again. So thank you to everyone, and goodbye. I think the speakers should stay on screen before...
Photo.
Class picture. Graduation.